The crystal stemware caught the candlelight like captured stars as my husband raised his glass to another woman, and I felt the precise moment my marriage shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. To Vivian, Marcus declared, his voice carrying across the hushed dining room with terrible clarity, a woman who never apologized for her fire, her ambition, her refusal to dim her light for anyone. He swayed slightly, wine-flushed and reckless, while 60 pairs of eyes darted between his ex-fiancée's triumphant smile and my carefully neutral expression. Sometimes, I wonder what life would have been like if I'd chosen differently. The Mountain Resort's grand dining hall, with its soaring timber beams and floor-to-ceiling windows framing the snow-dusted peaks, had fallen into the kind of silence that precedes catastrophe. I could hear my mother-in-law's delighted intake of breath, could see Marcus's sister covering her mouth in shock, could feel the weight of every Hartwell family member's gaze settling on me like a shroud. I did not flinch. I had been trained since childhood never to reveal weakness in public, a lesson from my grandmother Ashford that had served me through diplomatic dinners, museum galas, and now, apparently, my own humiliation at the hands of the man I'd loved enough to marry. Elena, Marcus's mother Patricia, cooed from her position at the head of the table, her perfectly lacquered smile sharp as a blade. Perhaps this is a moment for reflection. A wife should inspire her husband, don't you think? Make herself more exciting. She gestured vaguely at Vivian's plunging neckline and the diamonds glittering at her throat. Take some notes, dear. 3 years. I had given this family 3 years of my life, had endured their subtle condescension, their assumption that I was lucky to have married into their new money dynasty, their belief that my quiet work curating art and managing what they thought was a little family trust made me somehow less than them. I had smiled through their casual cruelty, their jokes about my preference for museums over shopping, my choice to work rather than lunch with the other tech wives, my refusal to perform the role of trophy. And now this. This public betrayal, this calculated cruelty from the man who had once promised to cherish me above all others. But they didn't know. None of them knew. Let me rewind, because the story of how I came to be sitting in that mountain resort, watching my husband toast his ex-lover while his family smirked at my humiliation, began long before Marcus Hartwell made his fortune in Silicon Valley, long before I ever met him at that charity auction 3.5 years ago. My name is Elena Margaret Ashford Hartwell, though I rarely use the Ashford name in public anymore. I am 32 years old, and I am the sole heir to a legacy that predates the American Revolution. The Ashford family fortune, built on shipping, steel, and strategic real estate investments across 3 centuries, had been managed with discretion and multiplied with patience by 7 generations of my ancestors. While the Vanderbilts built mansions and the Rockefellers built empires that drew public attention, the Ashfords built something more valuable: invisibility. My grandmother Caroline had been the matriarch who'd shaped my understanding of true wealth. Money that announces itself is money that makes itself a target, she'd told me countless times in her library overlooking Central Park. The families that last are the families people forget to notice. She'd raised me after my parents died in a sailing accident when I was 7, drilling into me the importance of discretion, education, and purposeful living. I'd earned my doctorate in art history, worked my way up from intern to curator at the Metropolitan Museum, published papers on Renaissance portraiture, and built a reputation on my own merit. The Ashford Foundation, the philanthropic arm of our family's holdings, operated under such careful anonymity that even the recipients of our grants rarely knew the true source of their funding. I'd met Marcus at a fundraiser for arts education. He'd been magnetic that night, talking passionately about using technology to democratize access to culture, about his working-class roots and self-made success. He'd built a software company from his garage and sold it for $200 million before he was 30. He was handsome, ambitious, and seemingly kind. When he'd asked about my work, he'd actually listened, had seemed genuinely interested in my research on stolen artworks and repatriation efforts. We dated for 8 months before he proposed, and I'd said yes because I believed I saw in him something real beneath the nouveau-riche polish. He'd met my grandmother before she passed, had been respectful and attentive. She'd given me her blessing, though I remember the concern in her eyes. "Guard your heart and your name, Alina," she'd whispered to me at our wedding. "Not all treasure is recognized by those who possess it." I'd taken his name when we married, not because I needed it, but because I'd wanted to build something new, separate from my family's legacy. I'd wanted to be loved for myself, not my balance sheet. So I'd let Marcus and his family believe that the Ashford family trust I managed was a modest inheritance, maybe a few million that I'd parlayed into a comfortable lifestyle working in museums. I'd let them think I'd married up. The condescension had started small. Marcus's mother Patricia asking if I needed shopping money for appropriate clothes for family events. His sister Rebecca wondering aloud if I found it intimidating to be married to someone so successful. The cousins and business associates who'd pat Marcus on the back and joke about him rescuing a poor academic from a life of ramen noodles and student debt. Marcus had never corrected them. At first, I'd thought he didn't notice. Then I'd realized he enjoyed it. Enjoyed being seen as the benevolent millionaire who'd elevated his wife's circumstances, who was generous enough to let her continue her little museum job, even though she didn't need to work. The cracks had widened over 3 years of marriage. Marcus traveled constantly, building his second tech venture, and I'd supported him, understanding that building a company required sacrifice. But the distance had grown beyond physical miles. He'd stopped asking about my work, stopped remembering the exhibitions I curated, stopped seeing me as a partner, and started seeing me as an accessory that didn't quite match his aesthetic. Then Vivian Chase had reappeared 6 months ago. Marcus's ex-fiancée, the woman he'd been engaged to before they'd spectacularly imploded over her affair with his former business partner. Vivian was everything Patricia Hartwell approved of. Loud, flashy, with an Instagram following in the millions, and a lifestyle brand selling overpriced wellness products to desperate housewives. She'd reinvented herself as a social media influencer after her previous ventures collapsed, and she'd been circling Marcus's orbit with increasing boldness. When Patricia had announced that Vivian would be joining us for the annual Hartwell family retreat, a long weekend at an exclusive mountain resort where Marcus's extended family gathered to network and show off their latest acquisitions, I'd known it was a setup. Patricia had never forgiven Marcus for choosing me over Vivian, had never accepted that her son might value substance over spectacle. The retreat had been 4 days of escalating tension. Vivian held court at every meal, regaling the family with stories of her latest collaboration with luxury brands, her appearances at exclusive events, her carefully curated life of enviable excess. She touched Marcus's arm constantly, laughed too loudly at his jokes, reminisced about their shared history with calculated nostalgia. And Marcus had responded. I'd watched him grow more animated in her presence, more dismissive of me. When I tried to share news about a major acquisition the museum had secured, a Caravaggio that I'd personally tracked down and negotiated for, he'd changed the subject to discuss Vivian's upcoming feature in Vanity Fair. When I'd suggested we take a morning hike together, just the two of us, he'd claimed Patricia had orchestrated the final dinner with the precision of a general planning a siege. She'd seated Vivian at Marcus's right hand, had seated me at the far end of the table between Marcus's elderly uncle, who was half-deaf, and a cousin's husband, who spent the entire meal on his phone. She'd arranged for the resort's best wine to flow freely, had ensured that the lighting was dramatic and the atmosphere thick with expectation. And then Marcus had stood, wine glass raised, and delivered his killing blow. To Vivian, a woman who never apologized for her fire, her ambition, her refusal to dim her light for anyone. Sometimes I wonder what life would have been like if I'd chosen differently. The words hung in the air like poison gas, suffocating and inescapable. I felt every molecule of oxygen evacuate the room. Patricia's face split into a smile of pure victory. Vivian's eyes gleamed with triumph as she raised her own glass, touching it to Marcus's with a delicate clink that sounded like a death knell. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for. The moment when quiet, boring Alina would finally break, would cry or rage or flee, confirming everything they'd always believed about my inadequacy, my unworthiness to be a Hartwell. Instead, I set down my napkin with careful precision. I stood, my chair scraping against the polished floor with just enough force to draw every eye in the room. My hands were steady as I retrieved my phone from my clutch, as I approached the resort's presentation screen that had been used earlier for a slideshow of family photos. "Marcus," I said, my voice cutting through the whispers with crystalline clarity, "I think it's time we were all honest about the choices we've made." He blinked at me, confusion clouding his wine-flushed features. Vivian's smile faltered slightly. Patricia leaned forward, scenting drama. I connected my phone to the screen with practiced ease. After all, I'd given enough museum presentations to know exactly how technology worked. The Ashford Foundation's annual report appeared on the screen, all 75 inches of it, the family crest prominent in the header. "Some of you may not be familiar with the Ashford Foundation," I began, my museum curator voice emerging, authoritative, educational, completely composed. "It was established in 1823 by my ancestor Nathaniel Ashford, and it has been managed by 7 generations of my family with a single mission: strategic philanthropy that changes lives without seeking recognition." I clicked to the next slide. The numbers appeared and I heard someone gasp. The foundation's assets under management, $4.7 billion. "The foundation operates in complete discretion," I continued, watching Marcus's face drain of color as he began to understand. "We fund everything from arts education programs to medical research, from environmental conservation to technology initiatives that democratize access to information." I clicked again. "Including a $20 million grant to the Very Accelerator program that helped launch Marcus's second company." Another click, another slide. This one showed a photo of the resort where we currently sat, with a document overlay showing the ownership structure. "The Ashford Foundation also maintains strategic real estate investments. This resort, for example, which underwent a $30 million expansion 2 years ago, is owned by a holding company in which the foundation has controlling interest. I personally approved the expansion plans." I smiled, meeting Patricia's shocked stare. "I'm glad you've all enjoyed the new spa facilities and the renovated conference center." The room had gone absolutely silent. Even Marcus's deaf uncle was leaning forward, squinting at the screen. I advanced through more slides, each one a carefully documented revelation. "The Hartwell Family Foundation, which Patricia chairs so proudly, received a substantial grant last year for your youth mentorship program. That came from us. The scholarship fund Marcus established at his alma mater, we matched it, dollar for dollar, anonymously. The art acquisition fund at the Children's Hospital Rebecca supports. That was an Ashford Foundation initiative I personally designed." I paused, letting the information settle like snow over the dining room. Vivian's mouth had fallen open, her Instagram-ready pout dissolving into something far less photogenic. Marcus had set down his wine glass and gripped the table's edge as if the floor were tilting beneath him. "I've spent 3 years with this family," I said quietly, "watching you assume that my work was a hobby, that my education was quaint, that my preference for substance over spectacle meant I was somehow lesser. I've smiled through condescension and cruelty because I believed in the man I married. I believed Marcus saw value in things that couldn't be measured by Instagram followers or press mentions." I clicked to a final slide, a simple photograph of Marcus and me on our wedding day, both of us laughing, both of us seemingly happy. It felt like looking at strangers. But tonight, my husband stood before his family and his ex-lover and told me exactly what I'm worth to him. He chose to humiliate me, to compare me unfavorably to a woman whose business ventures I happen to know are failing. "Yes, Vivian, I sit on the board of 3 venture capital firms, and your latest pitch for investment was rejected last month by all of them, because he's forgotten how to recognize value that doesn't announce itself with fireworks." Vivian had gone sheet white. Marcus tried to stand, reaching toward me with a desperate "Alina, wait." "I'm not finished," I said, and the authority in my voice, the voice of a woman who'd negotiated with heads of state over art repatriation, who'd convinced billionaires to fund museum wings, who'd been trained from childhood to command rooms far more powerful than this one, stopped him cold. "I want everyone here to understand something. I didn't hide my family's wealth because I was ashamed of it. I hid it because I wanted to be loved for myself, not my balance sheet. I wanted a partner who valued my mind, my work, my character. I thought I'd found that in Marcus." I looked at my husband, really looked at him, seeing clearly for the first time the weakness I'd been excusing for 3 years. But I was wrong. I disconnected my phone from the screen and turned to face the assembled Hartwell family, all of them frozen in various states of shock and mortification. Patricia, the foundation will be redirecting the grant we'd allocated for your mentorship program next year. I'm sure you'll find other funding sources, though you might try being kinder to the people you depend on. Rebecca, the hospital can keep their art fund. The children deserve beauty in their lives. But I'll be establishing it as a restricted gift that can't be used for your social committee's galas. I smiled at Marcus's cousin Jennifer, who'd always been kind to me. Jennifer, your environmental nonprofit will receive the expanded grant we discussed last month. You do good work, and you do it without needing applause. Then I looked at Vivian, whose face had crumpled into something ugly and desperate. And Vivian, darling, I know why you're really here. You've been hemorrhaging money since your wellness brand collapsed under regulatory scrutiny. Yes, I read the SEC filings. You thought if you could rekindle things with Marcus, you could secure investment for your next venture. But here's something you should know. Marcus's liquid assets total about $40 million. The Ashford Foundation's discretionary investment fund, which I control, is worth $600 million. You've been seducing the wrong person. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crack and pop of the dining room's fireplace. I gathered my clutch, smoothed down my dress, a vintage Dior that Vivian had sneered at earlier as understated, and prepared to exit with my dignity intact. Marcus finally found his voice. Elena, please, I was drunk, I wasn't thinking. You were thinking exactly what you've been thinking for months, I interrupted. That I wasn't enough, that I was boring. That you'd made a mistake choosing depth over dazzle. I shook my head. The mistake was mine, Marcus. I chose someone who couldn't see past surfaces, who measured worth in press clippings and social media engagement, who was so insecure about his own success that he needed a wife he could feel superior to. That's not, I never. He stumbled over his words, looking suddenly very young and very foolish. My attorneys will contact you on Monday, I said calmly. I'm filing for divorce on grounds of emotional abandonment and public humiliation. You can keep the house in Atherton, it's in your name anyway. I'll be returning to the Ashford estate in Connecticut, where I should have stayed in the first place. Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out strangled. You can't just, we didn't know. No, you didn't know, because you never bothered to ask. You never wondered why a poor museum curator wore vintage haute couture, or how I networked so effectively with donors, or why major collectors sought my advice on acquisitions. You saw what you wanted to see because it made you feel superior. I looked around the room one final time. The Hartwell family prides itself on being self-made, on earning respect through hard work and innovation. But you've spent 3 years disrespecting someone who worked just as hard, achieved just as much, and did it without needing to trumpet it from the rooftops. I walked toward the dining room's exit, my heels clicking against the hardwood with satisfying finality. At the doorway, I paused and looked back at Marcus, who'd slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. For what it's worth, I said quietly, I really did love you. I loved the man who talked about democratizing access to culture, who seemed to value substance over flash. But that man was either an illusion or you lost him somewhere along the way. Either way, he's gone now, and I'm done mourning him. I stepped out into the resort's lobby, where the night manager waited with my coat. I'd texted him earlier, during Patricia's dessert speech, knowing exactly how this evening would end. The Ashford Foundation's relationship with the resort meant certain courtesies were extended without question. Your car is ready, Ms. Ashford, he said, using my family name without hesitation. And I've had your luggage transferred from the Hartwell suite to your vehicle. Thank you, James. Please ensure the Foundation's usual donation is made to the staff fund this year. You've all been exemplary. Of course, ma'am, safe travels. I walked out into the mountain night, the air crisp and clean and filled with possibility. Behind me, I could hear the explosion of voices from the dining room as the Hartwell family imploded into recriminations and shock. Ahead of me, my driver held open the door of the Mercedes, and beyond that, the winding mountain road that would take me away from this place and back to my real life. The divorce proceedings were efficient, handled by my family's attorneys who'd been practicing longer than Marcus had been alive. He tried to contest it initially, showing up at my Connecticut estate with flowers and apologies, trying to explain that he'd been confused, that Vivian had manipulated him, that he saw clearly now what he'd had and thrown away. I received him in the library where my grandmother had once taught me the value of discretion, where family portraits dating back 2 centuries watched from the walls. "Elena, please," he begged, looking small and out of place among the antique furniture and priceless art. "I know I was an idiot, I know I hurt you, but we can fix this, I'll do anything." "Marcus," I said gently, because there was no cruelty in me despite everything, "you can't fix this because the problem isn't what you did. It's who you are. I can change. You don't even know what needs changing. You're sorry you got caught, sorry you lost access to my family's resources, sorry your mother is furious with you for blowing up the connection to the Ashford Foundation. But you're not sorry for the 3 years of subtle dismissal, for the 1,000 small ways you made me feel less than, for choosing to humiliate me rather than celebrate me." He opened his mouth to protest, but I raised a hand to stop him. "Do you know what the saddest part is? I would have shared everything with you. The foundation work, the investment decisions, the philanthropic strategy. I would have brought you into that world as a true partner if you'd ever shown interest in me as a person rather than as an accessory. But you never asked about my work beyond superficial questions. You never wondered how a museum curator afforded vintage Dior or had connections with major collectors. You didn't want to know, because my success threatened yours." "That's not true," he said weakly. "Isn't it? Be honest with yourself, Marcus, if not with me. You loved having a wife who made you feel magnanimous, generous, superior. The moment you realized I didn't need your money, didn't need your status, had my own power that dwarfed yours, that's when this became unfixable." I stood signaling the end of the conversation. "Sign the papers, move on. Build your company, find someone who fits your need to be the star. But stop pretending this was a mistake you can correct. It was 3 years of choices, and the choice to toast your ex-fiancé while mocking your wife was just the culmination." He left, finally, and 6 weeks later the divorce was finalized. He tried to demand a settlement until my attorneys reminded him that California's community property laws worked both ways, and did he really want to establish his net worth versus mine in court? He signed away all claims to my separate property, and I signed away any claim to his, and we went our separate ways. The aftermath rippled through Marcus's social circles like an earthquake. Patricia had a nervous breakdown when she realized that her cruelty had cost her family access to one of the country's most influential philanthropic networks. Rebecca tried to maintain a connection with me, but I politely declined. I had no interest in maintaining ties with people who'd stood by while I was mistreated. Vivian's attempted comeback collapsed spectacularly when business journalists started investigating why she'd been at the Hartwell retreat, uncovering her failed business ventures and rejected investment pitches. Her social media following turned on her with the viciousness of the internet, and last I heard, she'd relocated to Dubai to try reinventing herself again. Marcus's company struggled without the foundation's backing. It turned out several of his key investors had been connected to Ashford Foundation portfolio companies, and they quietly withdrew support when word spread of his behavior. He eventually sold to a competitor at a significant loss and took a position as an executive. As for me, I returned to my work with the foundation and the museum with renewed purpose. I threw myself into a major exhibition on Renaissance women artists, funding the research myself through the foundation and personally writing the catalog essays. It opened to critical acclaim, and I gave interviews where I spoke openly about my family's legacy and my philosophy of quiet philanthropy. I started dating again, eventually, though I was cautious. I met David at a symposium on art repatriation. He was a professor of international law specializing in cultural heritage protection. He was brilliant and kind, and utterly unimpressed by money. We talked for 6 hours that first night about Elgin marbles and Nazi-looted art, and the ethics of museum acquisitions. He'd been married before, had 2 teenage children he adored, had no interest in social climbing or status games. When I told him about the Ashford Foundation 3 months into our relationship, he'd simply shrugged and said, "That's nice. Can we get back to discussing whether the British Museum will ever do the right thing about Benin bronzes?" We married quietly 2 years later, a small ceremony in the estate's chapel with only close friends and David's children in attendance. No grand reception, no society coverage, just vows exchanged in a space where 7 generations of my family had pledged their lives to each other. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that dinner at the mountain resort. I think about the moment Marcus raised his glass to Vivian, the moment Patricia smirked at me, the moment I stood and reclaimed my power. I don't take pleasure in their suffering, that's not who I am. But I don't regret the lesson I taught them either. There's a difference between revenge and consequences, and what the Hartwell family experienced was simply the natural result of their own cruelty and short-sightedness. Marcus sent me a letter on what would have been our 5th anniversary. It was forwarded to me by my attorneys, who included a note asking if I wanted it blocked. I opened it, curious despite myself. The letter was handwritten, his normally confident scrawl shaky and uncertain. He wrote about regret, about finally understanding what he'd lost, about therapy and self-reflection and growth. He wrote about seeing my museum exhibition written up in the Times, about reading interviews where I spoke passionately about my work, about realizing he'd spent 3 years married to me without ever really seeing me. "I thought I was the prize," he wrote. "I thought you were lucky to have me, and I was generous to let you pursue your little interests. I can see now how insulting that was, how blind and stupid and unworthy. You deserved a partner who celebrated your brilliance, who was proud of your achievements, who saw you as an equal. Instead, you got me, someone so insecure in his own success that he needed to diminish yours." The letter ended with an apology and a wish for my happiness. No request to reconnect, no plea for forgiveness, just acknowledgement of the damage he'd done and hope that I'd found better. I showed it to David that night, over wine on the terrace overlooking the estate's gardens. He read it carefully, then handed it back to me. "Do you want to respond?" he asked. I considered it, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Then I shook my head. "No, that chapter is closed. Marcus got the lesson he needed. I hope it serves him well with whoever he builds a life with next. But that's not my concern anymore." David kissed my temple and refilled my wine glass. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the day end and the stars emerge, and I felt the deep contentment of a life lived on my own terms, with a partner who valued me completely. The Ashford Foundation continues its work, funding projects that change lives without demanding recognition. I still curate exhibitions, still pursue my research, still find joy in bringing beauty and knowledge into the world. And every time I make a decision about the Foundation's investments or philanthropic priorities, I remember my grandmother's words. "The families that last are the families people forget to notice." But I also remember the lesson I learned in that mountain resort dining room. That invisibility is powerful, but there are moments when power must be visible, when silence must break, when the quiet must speak truth to the loud. I am Alina Margaret Ashford, and I am my grandmother's granddaughter. I carry forward a legacy built on discretion and purpose, but I also carry forward the knowledge that true strength isn't just in staying silent, it's in knowing precisely when to speak, and ensuring that when you do, every word counts. Sometimes I wonder if other people carry similar stories, if there are others who have endured dismissal and disrespect from those who should have cherished them, who have had to choose between silence and self-advocacy, who have found their power in the moment they stopped accepting crumbs from tables where they should have been honored guests. If you've faced something similar, if you've been underestimated, overlooked, or openly disrespected by family members or partners who should have known better, I hope my story offers some comfort. And I hope you find the courage to stand, to speak, to reclaim your worth from those who tried to diminish it. Because in the end, the greatest lesson isn't about revenge or vindication. It's about knowing your value, refusing to accept less than you deserve, and walking away from anyone who can't see your worth. No matter how much they claim to love you, no matter how much they beg when they finally realize what they've lost. The dining room is empty now, the mountain resort silent. But somewhere in the darkness, someone is raising a toast to the wrong person, dismissing the right one, making choices they'll spend years regretting. And somewhere else, someone is standing up, reclaiming their power, and walking away toward the life they truly deserve. I know which person I am. I hope you know which one you are too.